The 10th Amendment, then, is one that is beginning to make a resurgence in the country. The 10th Amendment specifically says the powers, see the word powers, not delegated to the United States, that means the federal government, by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. This was for years a cornerstone of American freedom. It was the framers' view that government has only those powers that we as the people delegated to it specifically through the Constitution. It is largely being ignored today, however. Some states like Texas, Arizona, Oklahoma are beginning to reassert their state sovereignty in some pretty dramatic ways. The 11th Amendment in 1798 dealt with the lawsuit against the states. Remember, initially we said that states could not be sued or could be sued in federal court. This changed that. This amended Article 3, Section 2. It resulted from a lawsuit that was called Chisholm versus Georgia. This was probably considered the first Supreme Court decision that really had an impact in interpreting the Constitution. A gentleman by the name of Alexander Chisholm was the executor for the estate of a man named Robert Farquhar, who had died, and the state of Georgia owed Mr. Farquhar's estate money for deaths during the American Revolution. And Mr. Chisholm thought just because he died doesn't mean they should be able to squelch on their debts. So he tried to sue the state of Georgia to get the money for the estate. At that point, the Supreme Court did side with him, made the state of Georgia give him the money. The 12th Amendment made a change in the Electoral College. It provided that there would be a separate vote for president and a separate vote for vice president. It was fairly a minor kind of a procedural thing. The 13th Amendment came in 1865. It is the abolition of slavery. Now, again, time is so short, we can't go through this a lot. There were really, again, two views. You know, there's always two sides to every story. Early courts had ruled that all the 13th Amendment really did was abolish the institution of slavery, but it left any other forms of segregation or discrimination or separatism that a state wished to employ. It left that in place. However, we're going to go along here in a few minutes. You're going to find that by 1883, that idea had really begun to change in a decision called Jones versus Mayer. By this point, the Supreme Court has ruled that what they called all badges and incidences of slavery, segregation, denial of civil rights, were also prohibited by the 13th Amendment. This was the first time a phrase appeared in an amendment which has had dramatic influence on the American experience. The phrase said, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And that opened up the floodgates for Congress to do just about anything it wanted to do. This phrase was repeated in the 14th, 15th, 18th, 19th, 23rd, 24th, and 26th Amendments. It has greatly expanded federal power at the expense of state and individual rights. The 14th Amendment in 1868 was probably the most important of the amendments since the Bill of Rights, because what it did in dealing with issues that had involved former slaves ruled, or codified rather, that the states must respect all the rights that citizens of the United States have. So essentially what it says is a state has to provide each individual with the same Bill of Rights, the same protections as was under the Constitution, the federal Bill of Rights. The states could not deprive anyone of life, liberty, and property. And in the 14th Amendment is an important concept called the incorporation doctrine. And simply put, it simply means that the Bill of Rights applies to all government actions at all levels. So the Kettering City Council over here, under the 14th Amendment, has to respect those same Bill of Rights. Number 15. Oh, I'm sorry, we're not quite done. The states may not deny anyone the equal protection of the law. And here is something then that we need to take a minute and talk about. Those who aided the Confederacy under the 14th Amendment were barred from holding office or voting unless they were pardoned by Congress, and debts that were paid to Union soldiers were valid, but any debts that were owed to Confederate soldiers were invalid. Now, we could take a long time to talk about whether this was wise or not. In a nutshell, here's what had happened. At the end of the Civil War, there was great debate as to how the Union was going to be reconstituted. And there were those who had believed in what was called a hard war, a soft peace. That the North was going to go and completely obliterate the South's ability to wage war. But when the war ended, they were going to make it easy for them to come back into the Union. Not everyone agreed with that. This was Abraham Lincoln's idea, with malice toward none, with charity toward all. But there were many who wanted to see the South punished. And this group was able, in order to get Southern support for some of the things that were happening in the 14th Amendment, stuck in some of these things in order to, actually I said that wrong, in order to get the North to support the end of segregation against African Americans and former slaves, put this in there in order to cause it to be, yeah, the North, I'm going to go, we like that, let's get them. This is a way to get them. The principle that I want to say right here is this. We have to be very careful that we do not politicize the Constitution of the United States. This was a disastrous move, historically. This led to the rise of the Klan. It held the restoration of the South back for generations. This was a political move, and I believe we have to be so careful. The Constitution of the United States has to be the basic framework of our liberties, and it cannot become a tool whereby we advance our own agendas. The 15th Amendment was voting rights for former slaves, and says that U.S. citizens may not be deprived of the right to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 16th Amendment in 1913 is the progressive income tax. Now, interestingly, Congress had passed it in 1894, but the Supreme Court had ruled it unconstitutional. But it came back, racing back, and it was designed to be a very limited tax. I put in a few little things that make it interesting. If you made up in today's dollars $60,000, it didn't apply to you. After that $60,000, it was 1% of your income. But even at that point, they had the idea that, well, let's make the rich pay more. But in 1994 dollars, you had to make $7.5 million before you were considered the rich. And then the Congress put onto those rich what they called themselves the super tax. And the super tax was 6%. So you can see the difference. I'd be happy to be paying that super tax. Yeah. So there we have a little history of the 16th Amendment. The 17th Amendment changed from, remember we had initially the senators were appointed by the state legislatures. They were a check on federal power. This provides for their direct election to the Senate. The 18th Amendment is the prohibition of alcohol. The 19th Amendment is women's suffrage. The right to vote cannot be denied on the basis of sex. What's interesting is several states have already allowed women to vote. I believe her name was Jeanette Rankin. She was in the Congress before women had the nationwide right to vote. But she was from a state that allowed women. So it kind of happened in 1920 that several states had moved in that direction. The 20th Amendment in 1933 changed presidential succession again. We won't go into it because it's changed so many times. I do want to set your mind at ease, though. The official President Pro Tem of the Senate, this might set your mind at ease, however. I said Al Franken has been serving in that. Actually, the official one, I looked it up, is Daniel Inouye of Hawaii. So he is actually fourth in line to the presidency of the United States. But what the 20th Amendment did was it did move inauguration from what had been the 4th of March to the 20th of January. It shortened that period of the lame duck Congress, and by that time it was possible. Back at the time that the Constitution was first written, you might have been elected president, and by January 20th you might not even have heard the news yet, much less been able to get there. But by this point, transportation and communication made it possible to move it to the 20th of January. The 21st Amendment repealed prohibition, restored the authority to regulate alcohol to the states. The 22nd Amendment in 1951 established constitutionally the two-term limit for the president. The 23rd Amendment allowed the District of Columbia to have electors. Their electors are now equal to the number of electors from the least populous state, which I believe is Wyoming at this point. D.C. residents are now allowed to vote for president, but they still have no voting representation in Congress, and they are still not a state. The idea of our founders was if they were in a federal district, that way the capital of the United States did not have to be located in a particular state that might in some way give favoritism to that state. The 25th Amendment revised presidential succession again. The 26th Amendment dealt with the voting age, and please understand, it did not establish 18 as the age to vote. What it said is that no state may make a voting age greater than 18. If the state of Ohio wants to let 3-year-olds vote, they're free to do that. As long as by the time you're 18, you have the right to vote. That is something a little bit different. Because we've seen a change to where at one time voting was considered a privilege, a part of a landowner or some individual civic duty. Now it's seen more as a universal right that must be protected. And the 27th Amendment in 1993 dealt with congressional pay raises. And what is interesting about this, remember I told you when the states sent in those Bill of Rights, there were 12. 2 of them didn't make the cut. This is one that didn't make the cut. And it lay there partially ratified for a little over 204 years. And in 1993, when everybody got all hot and bothered about congressional pay raises, some historians said, hey, wait a minute. Whatever happened to that? And what was interesting was most amendments have a time limit of 7 years. But because that had been introduced as a part of the Bill of Rights, there had been no time limit set on people's ability to consider and discuss and talk about the Bill of Rights. So what they did was they pulled that out. I forget what state it is. You can look it up. But there were only 2 or 3 more states needed. They ratified it, sent it to the director of the National Archives, who said in his best opinion there was no limit placed on it because it had been a part of the Bill of Rights. He certified it, and we got the 27th Amendment. There are some who are questioning its validity, but that will be left for another day. So I almost did it. We did it. We made it all the way through. So, again, I thank you for staying with me, and I've done my best to try to make it as simple as I can. And as I said before, if you catch me in errors later, they are by, they're by